Hello everyone, it's Maz. Before we get to the latest episode with Dr. Ned Dobos, just a few announcements. Thanks to my now 14 patrons who have decided to support the show, I can now start getting some professional help with the editing and sound quality of my episodes. Hence, as of the next episode, you will hear a difference in the sound quality, and the conversations should be generally a little more crisp, cleaner, and simply better sounding. Thanks again to those 14 who have chosen to support the Voices of War. And for anyone else out there who has ever thought about supporting the show, now is definitely a good time. My aim is to try and outsource much of the back-end production process, which, believe it or not, takes a crazy amount of time, so that I can focus on the stuff you're here for. Insightful conversations with people who understand war. So if supporting the show is something you'd be willing to consider, please visit our Patreon page. The link is at the top of the show notes. Okay, so today I'm speaking with Dr. Ned Dobos, who is a senior lecturer at the University of New South Wales. You'll hear Ned's full background at the start of the episode, but I just thought I'd give you a little preamble on what's to come. As you'll hear, much of our discussion is based around Ned's recent book, Ethics, Security and the War Machine, The True Cost of the Military. I recently read the book, and as you'll hear, I really enjoyed it. The book raises some very important questions that are rarely, if ever, discussed. Ned and I speak about the thesis of the book, which asks whether this seeming inevitability and justification of war necessarily justifies maintaining a military. For some in the audience, this might seem like a perplexing question to ask, especially given what we're seeing in Ukraine. Ned and I try to wrestle with this issue, even in the face of an aggressor like Russia. We talked about the military serving as an insurance policy, as well as the challenges of the classic security dilemma. Ned also explained how fear-induced aggression works and discussed an interesting experiment known as the Preemptive Strike game. We then delved into another possibly controversial topic, and that is the suggestion by Ned that military conditioning and the accompanying indoctrination, which forms the backbone of any professional defense force, might itself pose a risk of moral injury. Again, some of my audience might find this an unconvincing argument, but I think it is well worth thinking about. We also touch on the civil-military culture gap, as well as the so-called Veteran Superiority Complex. Anyway, I think you'll find that this was a wide-ranging conversation, and that Ned has made a valuable contribution to an area that is rarely discussed, the moral cost of maintaining a military. I really enjoyed speaking with Ned, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. My guest today is Dr. Ned Dobos, who is a senior lecturer in international and political studies at the University of New South Wales in Canberra. He's the author of 2 books, Ethics, Security and the War Machine, The True Cost of the Military, as well as Insurrection and Intervention. And his research has appeared in journals such as Philosophical Studies, Ethics and International Affairs, Journal of Applied Philosophy, Journal of Moral Philosophy, and International Studies Quarterly. Ned has held visiting appointments at the Uhiro Centre for Practical Ethics at Oxford, the Macmillan Centre for International Studies at Yale, the McCoy Centre for Ethics at Stanford, and the Philosophy Department at Georgetown University. Currently, he is Associate Director of the International Society for Military Ethics, a co-editor at the Australian Journal of Human Rights, and Associate Editor of the Journal of Pacifism and Nonviolence. He joins me today to discuss his more recent book, Ethics, Security and the War Machine, The True Cost of the Military. I finished this book a few days ago and have found it to be exceptionally insightful, very timely, and actually really brave. Given the ongoing militarization and growing geopolitical tensions, I think you'll understand why I say brave as we delve into the book's messages. Ned, thank you very much for joining me on The Voices of War.
My pleasure.
Before we get stuck into the book, we must first address the obvious elephant in the room. Given your surname and the fact that I can actually pronounce it properly, I think we share some common cultural heritage. What is your cultural background?
So my parents are from the former Yugoslavia. My mother is ethnically Serb. My father is ethnically Croat.
Right. So the movie Wog Boy would have brought some jokes for you.
Exactly. Yes. I
Tony the
hate
Yugoslav?
myself.
Yeah.
That's right. But I've got still some family over there. I was born here in Australia, but I did get a chance to visit back in 2008, I believe. So saw my cousins for the first time, my uncle who passed away recently. It was quite an experience.
Yeah. So you still, I guess you have a relatively strong connection to those roots. But has that cultural background in any way influenced your professional pursuits? I mean, particularly military ethics?
Not consciously. I mean, who knows? Obviously, growing up when the war in the former Yugoslavia broke out in the 1990s, my whole family was glued to the TV screen and the news, watching what was happening. Now, I didn't really pay much attention. I was still a child. I was sort of more interested in playing Nintendo at the time. But who knows if that had any kind of the fact that was so salient to my family. Perhaps that had played some role in getting me interested in this particular line of inquiry. But it could just be a coincidence. I don't know. We'd have to get us kind of a psychoanalyst to try and tease that out.
Yeah. So how do you explain it to yourself then? I mean, when people, I'm sure people ask you, how did you end up in military ethics? So, I mean, what is the narrative that you have in your mind?
The conscious explanation is it was completely by accident.
Okay. I'm hearing this time and time again. It's amazing. Yeah.
So, I mean, long story short, I got to university just doing an arts degree, had no idea what I wanted to do with myself. At the time, I had enrolled in English literature because that's what I liked at high school. But then university English literature and high school English literature are completely different things. So I just hated it. Needed to pick up another subject to make up for one of the English subjects I dropped. And I picked a subject called Studies of Human Nature, which was a philosophy subject. And that was right up my alley. So that was my first taste of philosophy, really liked it. And by second year, I was pretty much doing all philosophy and a little bit of political science. So I got to the end of my undergraduate degree, got my major in philosophy, and I was offered honors to do one extra year, do an honors year. Now, I had no idea what I wanted to write my thesis on. I went and spoke to the honors coordinator, and that was shortly after the September 11 attacks. And he said, "Oh, well, why don't you do something on the ethics of terrorism? That's kind of a hot topic." And I said, "Okay, sold. I'll do that." Just so it was topical. It was the first suggestion that was thrown at me. It kind of, I thought it was philosophically interesting. And so that was kind of my first project, which is in military ethics broadly construed. I guess if you like, it's all about civilian immunity and whether there's something especially objectionable about killing civilians as opposed to killing uniformed military personnel. And so that's it. So that was my first main research project in applied ethics, and it happened to be in applied military ethics. And so once you're kind of in it, then the PhD comes along, and I already know this field. You don't want to start over in a completely new. Anyway, so I that's how I found myself in military ethics. I also do a bit of kind of business ethics and professional ethics as well.
Right. Okay. It's very interesting. I mean, I think the book, and as again, it'll become evident as we talk. I said at the start that it's brave, especially given the fact that you teach at the Australian Defence Force Academy. And ultimately the book's title, I mean, which is, the true cost of the military, in itself is somewhat controversial when you start, peeling back what the book's actually about. So maybe we can start by, getting you to explain what is the main thesis of the book? What are you actually trying to achieve with it?
All right. So even if war is sometimes morally justified, if we grant that there is such a thing as a just war, that doesn't mean that war-making institutions or militaries are justified in existing. So that's it in a nutshell, but I'll flesh that out a bit. So all sorts of things can be justified under certain circumstances. In fact, for any action you can think of, no matter how cruel or disgusting or evil it is, I bet you I can think of a scenario where it would actually be justified to do that thing. Okay. So let's say torture, for example. I can easily describe a scenario where most people would agree that torture would be justified. I think, there's a terrorist, he's planted a bomb, the clock is ticking. If you torture him, he'll give up the information. You'll be able to defuse the bomb. If you don't torture him, he won't disclose it. 1 million people will die. In that kind of scenario, I'm prepared to say, look, maybe torture would be justified. Fine. But does that mean we should have a department of torture with torture facilities and training centers that our taxes pay for? Should we have a public institution devoted to torture just because we can imagine cases where torture is justified? I think most people will agree. Surely not. So if we're asking whether militaries are justified in existing, it's not enough to simply point out that war can be justified, because even if that's true, it doesn't follow that it's permissible to prepare for war by militarizing. And, relatedly, whenever I talk to people about this, I often quickly encounter this question that's apparently meant to settle the matter. The question usually goes something like, but what will we do if? My sister, I had a conversation with her last week, and she said, well, what will we do if China invades?
Yeah.
Right. So think about what's happening there. The questioner is identifying a scenario where it looks like if we don't have a military, we have little or no defensive recourse. But again, what will we do if ... by itself is not a very good argument for anything. And to try and tease this out, just think about how that argument sounds in different contexts. Okay, so let's, very topical. We had another mass shooting in the US recently. Back in 2009, there were a spate of these mass shootings in quick succession. And as what usually happens when these things occur, a lot of people start calling for tighter gun control. Particularly at the time in 2019, people were focusing on the kind of high capacity semi-automatic assault rifles, saying that these things should be prohibited. Why do civilians need these assault rifles, right? These machine guns. But then along comes one guy on Twitter and asks serious question. Asks, well, I live in a rural area. There are these groups of feral hogs that stampede around, and he asks something. The question was something like this: if I don't have my high capacity semi-automatic, what am I meant to do if 30 to 50 feral hogs break into my yard while my small kids are playing there? Right? So this guy's basically asking, if I don't have a machine gun, what will I do if ... He's describing a scenario in which only one of these weapons will give him a chance of defending his children against this threat. And on the basis of this, he's insinuating that it's legitimate for him to have this weapon. Now, nobody took that seriously, right? In fact, that tweet became like a meme, became this object of ridicule on the internet. So what will we do if a foreign aggressor threatens our sovereignty? That's just a scaled up version of what will I do if a stampede of feral hogs breaks into my yard while my small kids play.
I mean,
I appreciate that there are disanalogies, right? All I'm really trying to say is these questions by themselves aren't compelling arguments for anything. There's much more that we need to consider before we can reach any conclusion. And, in the gun case, that's just obvious to us. We say, fine, there might be rare scenarios where you need this weapon to defend your children against feral hogs, but we've got to consider all of the costs associated with allowing people to have these weapons. And my book is just making the same move with regards to the military. The military also has costs. And in order to determine whether that institution is justified in existing, we've got to do a kind of a moralized cost-benefit analysis. It's not enough to simply point out that sometimes we might need it and sometimes its use would be justified.
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more. I mean, bottom line up front, I mean, I say this time and time again, I'm as close to a pacifist as one can be while wearing uniform. So I wholeheartedly agree that if we could make the militaries around the world, if we could all become Costa Rica, I would be a very happy man, even though I wouldn't have a job. But that would be a very small price to pay. The only thing that pops into my mind, though, is, I mean, I have car insurance, I have home insurance, and all of this is for the what if, right? Now, the premiums are getting higher and higher depending on how many crimes or accidents occurred in my particular area. And I'm prepared to pay that premium, even though, that premium is it's unlikely going to be around, 2% of my personal GDP for the year. But it's certainly, high enough for me to, strongly consider, is this worth it? But then I look at the cost versus benefit and I said, okay, well, that's a fair enough investment to have security against the unforeseen event that I ultimately can't really plan for. And as we all know, geopolitics, war is not rational. It's emotional. It's human. It just happens. There are upstream causes that will lead to it, of course. But to not have an insurance policy against such an attack, some would probably question.
Yeah, I think the way you're thinking of it is spot on, and it's the way that I would be inclined to think of it. The military should be thought of as kind of insurance coverage. You have it just in case. But that's, for me, that's kind of grist for the mill, because let's go back to your scenario of the home insurance. Presumably, Maz, you would agree that there comes a point at which the premiums are so high it's no longer rational.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. So I remember when I first moved here, when I first bought a place here in Canberra, I got the home insurance, and then contents insurance were offered. And I was a single bachelor. I had nothing of value in my house except my PlayStation. I looked at the premiums that were going to charge me for my contents insurance, and I just thought, it's not worth it. Right. So with regards to insurance, I just think we need to be open to the proposition that it's not worth having regardless of what the cost is.
Yes.
Whereas I think when we talk about the military, sometimes our mental model deviates from the insurance model, because we act as though it is worth having regardless of what the cost is. But we don't think of other insurance policies like that. With every other insurance policy, we say, okay, let's see what I'm getting. Let's see what the risk is. Let's see what the cost is. And I'm just saying we ought to do all of that stuff with regards to the military. Now, sometimes the conclusion will be, yeah, the military is costly, but it's still worth having given our circumstances, given the likelihood of conflict in our region, so on and so forth. But I think we should be open to the possibility that sometimes, for some countries in some places, maybe the answer will be the same answer I reached when I was offered contents insurance, which is it's not worth it. And that's exactly the conclusion. That's the conclusion that the Costa Ricans came to. Yeah. Right? They're like, there's some benefits to be had by having this institution, but there's also some costs, and we don't really have any enemies. And our schools are dilapidated and our environment's going to hell. So they just decided to repurpose their military spending into that. And that seems to me a perfectly... I'll put it this way. It's not obvious to me that what Costa Rica did back then was just obviously irrational and stupid. Maybe it was just appropriate.
They haven't been invaded, right?
Yeah.
So, they housed the UN Peace University, I believe, as well.
They do, yeah. There have been attempts, right? Nicaragua tried to encroach on their territory several times shortly after demilitarization, but they just found other ways to handle that.
But wasn't one of the reasons that they had a big, bad, powerful friend to the north by the name of US?
Well, look,
that had a much bigger stick than Nicaragua.
Yeah. Look, so that's the sort of
that's the retort, I guess.
That's exactly
that one
right.
would expect.
Yeah. But the thing is, there's no way to falsify that.
Yes. Yeah.
Like you could always say, well, the reason they haven't been invaded is because they think America's going to stay, and everyone else is deterred by the prospect of US intervention. Maybe, but what's the proof of that? Maybe they haven't been invaded because nobody wants to invade them. Maybe it's as simple as that. Maybe it doesn't need deterring. Just like, the reason I look, if I were to go and burgle my neighbor's house, there's a good chance that I would be caught and punished for it by the state. And that's enough to deter me. But frankly, I don't need deterring. I don't want to go and burgle my neighbor's house. I'd rather have good relations. And there's not that much to be gained. It doesn't look like they're particularly well-to-do, so I don't think they have any $50,000 watches. So, the
motivation is lacking. The incentive is not there.
Yeah, I'm just saying that's possible. There's this kind of tendency in international relations discourse in particular to think that country A has not invaded country B. It must be because country A has been deterred by country B's military. But we don't think like that in any other domain. We don't think, well, there's these two people walking down the street. That guy is not beating up that guy. It must be because he's scared of the police. Maybe there's other reasons. Maybe he's just not a jerk. And that wants to. No,
I totally hear you. I mean, I'm merely playing the devil's advocate because I've had similar debates, not to the depth that your book now gives me ammunition to employ. But yeah, that seems to be the sensitivity with people, that it's simply unthinkable that say China would not invade Australia because we are such a resource-rich country and we have so much space, and therefore we need to have insurance policy. Now, this, and you talk about this in the book, this very much leads to the kind of classic security dilemma. Can you explore that a little bit, just to how we find ourselves in that, I guess, security dilemma, and how does this investment in the military contribute to it?
Okay, so I mean, the classic security dilemma is what happens when you've got multiple agents all seeking their own security, making investments in their own security, and by so doing, causing insecurity in others, which in turn puts themselves at risk. So, I'm worried about, and in the worst case scenario, this can kind of boil over into a sort of a preventive strike or defensive aggression, as I call it in the book. Let's say, I mean, there have been lots of cases like this. States, some wars that have occurred in history have been what we might call opportunistic aggression, where it's sort of what you described that people are worried about with regards to China. We've got these natural resources. If we're defenseless, they'll exploit that weakness and pounce, right? So they're coming to gain. So, and that's happened through history, that kind of opportunistic aggression. But there's another kind of aggression that's happened time and time again through history as well, which is fear-induced aggression, where it's not let's go and get what they have. They've got some offensive capabilities over there. Who knows what they're planning? We better get in first so that we never have to find out.
Yeah. Okay. You talk about the Preemptive Strike Experiment in the book, and maybe you can touch on that, because I think that's a really, really useful and nuanced way to think about this. And I think it's also, relevant to, you talked about the gun violence in the US piece. I think it all kind of packages it nicely. So what is the Preemptive Strike Experiment?
Yeah. So the Preemptive Strike game, it should probably be referred to as the Preventive Strike game for terminological accuracy. But basically, the experiment involved giving people a certain amount of money and pairing them up. So you've got two players. Each player has a button, and that button, if you press it, that constitutes an attack, right? And if you press your button, you lose some of your money. I think it was like $1,000. You lose $100 out of $1,000, but the other guy loses $900. Okay, and vice versa. Okay, but if neither of you press your button after 1 minute, then you both go home with $1,000. And so that's clearly the optimal strategy. Just don't press your buttons. But of course, everyone looks and thinks, oh, but he's got a button. If he presses his button, I'll lose 900. So I better press my button first so that he loses 100 and 900 and I only lose 100. So basically, in order to protect themselves, people end up attacking. People attack out of defensive motives because they're worried about what you might do in the future with your offensive capabilities. So,
which is that fear-induced defensive aggression, as you call it.
So I think this really kind of complicates the rationality of having a military establishment. So we focus almost entirely on the deterrent effects of militaries without factoring in the provocative effects of military. So I like to use this analogy sometimes, just kind of using guns again, just because it helps us think through some of these issues. So, imagine you're about to walk into a hypothetical scenario. You're about to walk into some gathering, a house party, where there's going to be all sorts of violent criminals, and you know this, and they're eager to get their hands on your property, your sneakers or your watch or whatever. Before you go in there, I
didn't realize you grew up in Sydney as well.
Western suburbs of Melbourne. So yeah.
Right. Okay. So went to the same parties then. Sorry, man.
Suppose before you enter this gathering, I offer you a gun or a knife to protect yourself. And, let's say there's not going to be any police there, so you've got no other recourse. Now, on the face of it, it seems quite sensible, prudent for you to accept the weapon, like just in case. So you can deter with your knife and you can fend off these marauders if they come after you. But now suppose I kind of throw some additional information in there. I say, look, aside from these violent bandits that want your sneakers, there's going to be some kind of highly paranoid schizophrenics in there as well. And they think everyone's out to get them. They don't want your stuff. They don't want your sneakers. But if they see you as a threat, they'll come after you. They'll strike first, right? Is it still sensible for you to take the weapon? It's just not so clear anymore, right? Granted, if you openly carry the knife into the gathering, it will have some deterrent effect on the ones that want your sneakers, on the marauders. They would always prefer to go after an easy target, someone weak and defenseless, take their sneakers. But at the same time, openly carrying the knife makes you a target for the highly paranoid types. They're not interested in your property, but they are interested in neutralizing the threats that they perceive. And the knife in your hand puts you in that category, right? And so that complicates the decision considerably. It might be prudent to accept the weapon. It might not be. It depends on other variables. But the point is, in this scenario, you can't confidently generalize that going in armed is always the prudent thing to do. Being defenseless might actually increase your chances of survival. Being defenseless might be more rational, as paradoxical as that sounds. Your defenses go down, but your security goes up, right? Because if you go in armed, you invite, yes, you deter one kind of aggression, but you invite fear-induced aggression or preventive aggression. You take the risk of provoking the paranoid types. And I think we should think of the international arena as that house party writ large, right? And this is not my idea. This is Hobbes, right? There are three causes of war. Two of them. One of them is competition. One state attacks another to acquire its territory or resources. But the other is what he calls diffidence. One state attacks another to remove a looming threat that the latter is thought to pose. Right? The aggressors here are the paranoid types. So standing armies, insofar as they wield both offensive and defensive capabilities, they deter the first kind of aggressor, but they're liable to provoke the second. And that just opens the possibility of a military being self-defeating in the sense of it reduces the overall level of security of its parent society. Right. So the important insight there is, you watch the news and politicians will say, we need to strengthen our national security. And by that, they mean we need more military capability, as though more military capability and more national security are the same thing. They're not. Okay. They aren't identical. You've got to think about how other agents are going to react to your increased military capabilities. And if the consequence is that they're going to react in a way that makes them actually more likely to attack you because they fear you more, then your military capability has gone up, but your security hasn't gone up with it. It's gone down, right?
But it serves the narrative that look, I told you they're a threat, so therefore we need more military.
Exactly.
Now.
So it becomes
that's the security dilemma, right? That's where we kind
exactly
of
right. Exactly right.
Kind of, and the problem becomes, and again, I can just hear some of my listeners say, "Hold on a minute, but what about Russia right now? You know, we tried the peaceful solutions. We tried to, make security arrangements with Russia. We tried to bring Russia into the fold. In fact, many will say we tried to bring China into the fold, but look where we are. Russia is invading Ukraine. There's war crimes going on. China is, becoming more and more aggressive, despite, as some would say, the Western or global even attempts to integrate them into the global community in a more peaceful way. How do you respond to that? How do we defend against the likes of Russia, of China, of North Korea, of Iran, etc.?
Yeah, look, there's the kind of empirical social scientific stuff in here about whether and the extent to which we have adequately tried to deal peacefully with China and Russia and so on and so forth. But let's kind of set that aside and grant for the sake of, with the Russia example, I think one thing worth thinking about is whether this, if you accept Putin's narrative, at least, and I'm not saying that I do, but his narrative at least is that what I'm doing is fear-induced aggression, right? I'm not trying to conquer new land to create a Russian empire. Essentially, what I'm worried about is Ukraine proposing to join NATO and therefore thereby making Europe's army its own and putting it right on my border.
Yeah, so it's increasing one security at the cost of someone else's. Yeah. And there's something to be said for that. I'm not sure if this is right, but I heard somewhere a credible source that Russia started preparing for this operation almost immediately after Ukraine announced its intentions to join NATO. Right. So that kind of lends some support to the idea that this is not an aggressive intervention. This is not an opportunistic intervention that you can try and prevent by becoming stronger. This is the kind of aggression that you provoke precisely by trying to become stronger. Right. So it's just not clear that, some people look at this situation in Ukraine and say, well, see, this is why Ukraine needs to have a stronger military, and this is why we all need to have a stronger military. That's one way to look at it. But then the other way to look at it is, no, this happened in part precisely because Ukraine was trying to strengthen its military capabilities. So, is military strength here something that helps, or is it the liability that, suppose if Ukraine were demilitarized, right? And this is one of Putin's kind of stated objectives, to demilitarize Ukraine. Suppose Ukraine were already demilitarized, or rather than ramping up their military spending and proposing to join NATO, they were proposing to go in the opposite direction and being more neutral and more demilitarized. Would this war still have happened? Would Russia still have invaded under those circumstances? Well, it did in 2014, I guess. I tried to have this discussion a number of times with people from both Ukraine, but also NATO and et cetera. But I think the theory is no longer sound because, Putin has accepted that Sweden and Finland, and has openly said, I'm fine. I've got no issue with them going into NATO. So that's been kind of shot out of the water a little bit, as in, it might be a neat narrative for him to challenge the globe or the kind of global, or present a narrative that has some resemblance of credibility to it. But then, we also know that, Crimea was an annexation. That is a land grab. We also know Donbass, that's a land grab. And the fight for now, which basically makes it a bit more. Having said that, though, this is not me trying to argue against the point you're making, because I do agree. The point I think we need to talk about is the upstream causes that bring us down to this point. Like Ukraine is not now, as in that didn't happen today. This is a build-up, post the fall of the Soviet Union. And could we have done something to pacify Russia in a way? Is that, especially, of course, this is a war in many ways between Russia and the US, the global hegemon, calling the shots. Has it always treated Russia the way it should have, the way it could have brought Russia in a bit more, which is, that's the challenge. And all of these kind of, again, the fear-induced aggression didn't occur today. It exists. It exists for eternity. So it causes a much further back.
So, I mean, we certainly need to look at things in their historical and political context. But I think, look, here's really what I want to say in response to this kind of case. I don't want to deny it. I don't want to deny that sometimes some countries will make land grabs. And with respect to those types of countries, it might make sense to have a military because it will deter them. I'm just saying, if you build up a powerful military in order to deal with that problem, you create for yourself another kind of problem.
Yeah. And we're not accounting for that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's it. You might, let's say,
let's have a rational argument about it rather than just
essentially. Yeah. So, okay, let's get some WMDs so that Russia never attacks us and tries to take some of our land. But now the Americans are saying we've got to go, this European dictator is building WMDs and you end up being another Iraq. That's,
exactly.
So that's all I'm saying. We focus entirely on, you got the cost benefit table of your military establishment, and we focus tunnel vision only on the benefits. Not appreciating how when you militarize to solve one set of problems, you introduce another set of problems.
Yeah, and the costs that we don't talk about, and that's really what you're. And again, I can't praise your book highly enough because it's so relevant to what's happening in the world today. One of the things that, in fact, chapter 1 that you talk about is you refer to as military conditioning and how it can cause or contributes to moral damage, and that's the first cost you identify in your book. As one that we don't really address. And I love that one because that was a really, really powerful opening. It's definitely not one we talk about, but one that it's come up in my podcast so many times already is just this kind of desensitization process that occurs just by wearing a uniform. What do you mean by that exactly?
Well, so by sort of two things I need to define. By military conditioning, and I kind of, in hindsight, I can see I'm not precise enough with that term in my book, but I simply kind of mean the training and socialization that recruits undergo in order to make them effective on the battlefield. Okay, from repetitive drill training to the indoctrination of military values and like loyalty and sacrifice.
Shaving your head day one.
Yeah. All that, to make you part of the unit, to break down your individuality, all of that, everything that the institution puts you through in order to turn you into a competent soldier. That's what I mean by military conditioning. Okay. Yeah. And now
it's creating a particular, sorry to jump in. There's just to interpret in my mind, the way I see it is creating a particular in-group that is bounded and governed by certain values and norms that exists for the sole purpose of prosecuting war. In other words, killing. And we don't talk about it as plainly as that, but ultimately, when you boil down to it, that's what it does. So that's why I just wanted to interpret it from my brain, how I see it. How I see military, indoctrination or conditioning. Yeah. So,
perfect. Right. Couldn't have put it better myself. Yeah. That's right. So it's kind of making people more comfortable with politically motivated violence or violence under orders. Now, as you say, one point I try and make in the book is that, there's a lot of discussion of quote unquote moral injury now among ethicists and philosophers, among psychologists, among military people more generally. This term has really caught on, moral injury. And most of the discussion is about the moral injuries that people sustain in war. What does the experience of war do to you? And that's all very important. And and
you're a big voice on this as well. I mean, I might add, yeah.
But I think we need to appreciate that it's not just war, the experience of war, that inflicts moral injury. It's also the preparation for war. Military conditioning can also be morally injurious in one sense of the word. So the tricky thing is the term moral injury it's not used with any consistency. And there are at least two things that we might mean by it. It either refers to an acute aggravation of the moral emotions like guilt, shame, remorse, or it refers to the silence of those emotions. So here's an example that I like that I think illustrates well. So following pair of cases, you got the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, right? So you got Claude Etherly. He was the reconnaissance pilot that flew the reconnaissance plane over Hiroshima immediately before the bombing. And he could hardly live with himself afterwards, right? He was completely guilt-ridden to the point of dysfunction. He became a pacifist, not that that's a form of dysfunction, but he became, sent letters of apology to the families and their victims, attempted suicide, psychiatric treatment. He even, became this kind of petty criminal. He would do very bizarre things, like he'd go around town and he'd shoplift.
Just to get punished,
Just to get punished, because he was treated like a hero by the American public, but he didn't see himself that way. He felt like a real piece of shit, and he wanted the community to see him that way. So that's what some people see as moral injury, right? That sort of experience, this kind of overactive conscience that makes it impossible for you to live a normal life. But compare that guy, Claude Etherly, to the guy that actually dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. His name was Paul Tibbets. And he was, by most accounts, completely untroubled. He even went to model aircraft shows with children and reenacted the obliteration So didn't bother him at all that he killed scores of innocent people. He was sort of numb or indifferent. So his conscience wasn't overactive. It was just completely inactive, non-responsive to this. But we can't help but feel that there's something wrong with that, right? So this moral numbness or indifference, that's what some people mean by moral injury. And I think that's a better use of the term. The thought is a morally decent, healthy person can't kill people without being distressed by it. Even if the killing is justified, if it's justified, it's a sign of virtue that it's difficult for you. Right?
That's really interesting. I mean, I've had a couple of people, even recently, special forces operators who've been, who've engaged in the act of killing time and time again. And I've asked them these questions, how does that feel? And the response is that, your training kicks in and you just do what you do. It's surgical, it's precise. You don't necessarily mourn over it. You don't celebrate it. You don't cherish it. And I'm always perplexed because I've never had to fire a gun in anger, so I wouldn't have a clue what that would feel like. As much as I've envisioned myself in those situations, like most of us have in some sense, I'm always perplexed. Is that, and my dad was on the front lines for 3.5 years. I know he's been engaged in the act of killing himself. I don't know what impact that's had on him. He's had challenges with coming to terms with what's happened. But I just can't still clearly delineate if this is, somebody who says, no, it's fine. It's part of the job. Is that already a moral injury? I mean, is that, because maybe it ought to be. I don't know. But also then I also want especially our frontline soldiers to have the defensive mechanisms to go and do the job that we're asking them to do.
Yeah.
So I'm a little bit torn about how to actually define these sentences that it's just part of the job kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's anything contradictory or inconsistent in having these two thoughts simultaneously. So I agree with everything that you just said. Yes, we do want, if we're deploying these people to go overseas and do things on the state's behalf, such as kill, we want to do everything that we can to ensure that doesn't ruin them for life.
Yeah.
Okay. Fine. Therefore, if we're going to have a military, we do want to, for lack of a better term, desensitize. We do want to numb them to some extent to protect them from this kind of psychological, emotional, moral disintegration. But all I'm trying to emphasize is that's a cost. You're degrading these people's character. Don't try and explain it away by denying the label moral injury or by saying, well, look, we want this to happen. It's justified. We need to protect them. I agree with all of that. But that doesn't mean that we're not doing something that's kind of regrettable and unfortunate to these people. So, my answer to the question, when you encounter someone who they can kill people and you ask them, how does that feel? And they say, it feels like nothing to me. I would say that person is already morally injured. It's not to say, it's not to blame them.
Yeah, 100%. Absolutely.
It's not to say that we are not justified in doing this to them for the sake of protecting them against even worse harms. That's all still open and on the table. I'm just saying it is what it is, right?
We have to account for it. Yeah.
It has to be in the accounting.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I recently put out a short little thought bubble piece on the Forge, where I talk about this, and even now it relates to me. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Le Guin's "The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas," which is basically a very short essay, 3-page essay, that basically talks about a town that lives in bliss, but it has one child that's locked away in a cellar that's suffering, right? And they can continue on and live their bliss but only for as long as this child is suffering, and they will go and feed it and see the child, and children will be taken there. And this is the sacrifice for our bliss that we live in our peaceful Omelas. And this is that when I read that, it resonated so strongly with me about that's exactly what we're doing to our soldiers. Our soldiers ultimately could be viewed as the suffering child in the basement, and as I worded in the piece, of our civility. This is the child in the basement of the supposed civility that we so dearly embrace, especially when we sit on our high horse, in the kind of developed societies and say, hey, we're morally just and right, and we send our soldiers forth to fight just wars. But of course, it is our soldiers that pay the price because they're the ones that are pulling the trigger. Even those who, and I couldn't agree more again, and I would never, ever second guess even some of the people that I've interviewed because I respect what they've done. But I also do tend to think that there has to be, it shouldn't be so matter of fact to talk about the act of killing, or that killing is part of your job. It just feels, I don't know how we can try and make something so humane, which is what we're trying to do, right? Which is what and I think you talk about this, and it was such a strong point of the book for me. When you're talking about the operational language, and I've talked about this previously. The language we use around military operations is so precise, so accurate, so removed from emotion. It's the opposite of interpersonal. Right. It's, and I think you talk about the operational titles even in there, they're also kind of value loaded, or I don't have any of them in front of me now, but, they can't somehow echo justice. And this is the right thing to do and noble thing to do, coupled with, neutralizing the threat, collateral damage. We're not saying I've just slaughtered a family, or I've just killed the father of a 3-year-old child, it's collateral damage. It is for, in order for me to prosecute my objective or my target. And all of that is part of, I think, what you're trying to say is a cost. That's the unaccounted cost, or at least the first unaccounted cost of both the military, but also then, the going to war. How do we manage this kind of desensitization and moral injury post-conflict? Because if it's not discussed that, hey, when you join, we're going to take you from, starting point of, let's assume, a healthy person that has, the right kind of moral compass and broadly speaking, what, at least the average person will think is the right thing to do. We're going to now shift and hope to take all those values with you, but we're going to expose you to all of these circumstances that are going to, in a very, very, in some cases, minor way, morally degrade you. How do we then, well, firstly, talk about that openly, because that's going to be a disincentive for people joining. But also, more importantly, how do we deal with it? When people come back, or when they're wanting to, leave the military, because it's a hell of a thing, to be part of a cohesive unit. It is so all encompassing. So it becomes part of your identity. How do you unpack that?
Yeah. So great question. And I don't know yet. This is, when I say I don't know, I'm responding to the part of your question, which is, what do we do about this? So there's a really a great line. It was one of the training officers in Vietnam, an American who was responsible for putting recruits through some kind of final indoctrination as they arrived in the country. And he did an interview some years later where he said something along the following lines. It's not verbatim, but it's roughly this. He says, every time I turn on the TV and I hear news about a murder, I wait and see if it was a Vietnam veteran. And he said, we turn those people into killers. We program them to kill, but nobody's unprogramming them, man. Right? So unprogramming, right? So that's what we need to think about. I mean, if it's true, and a lot of people are going to deny this, that military conditioning does involve this moral degradation, moral injury. And look, the jury's still out on that. I mean, my hypothesis is that it aims to inflict moral injury. Okay, but I can't say definitively whether it actually does consistently degrade moral character. You'd need some kind of empirical study for that. But we do have some studies, some empirical studies, which show that military conditioning does change people's character long term, even if they weren't deployed. Right? So there was a study out of Germany, and it doesn't really tell us anything about whether people that go through military conditioning are more comfortable with violence. That may be its aim, but we don't know if that actually happens consistently. But this study did show that people that have gone through military conditioning are generally less agreeable. And when they unpack what that means, it's kind of more prone to conflict in their day-to-day civilian lives. So we do have evidence to suggest that military conditioning affects your character. And we've got empirical evidence for that. But okay, so let's just kind of grant that military conditioning does things to people's personalities. And I suspect one of the things it aims to do is to morally desensitize people. So what do we do about that? So one, to me, this is a little bit of wishful thinking, but some commentators in this space would have us believe that as long as we do it right, this kind of conditioning and desensitization, it'll kind of lapse over a period of time. It's just kind of a temporary thing. You put like an anesthetic, you inject it and they go numb, but then it wears off. The body just kind of flushes it out. Now, some of the commentary in this space suggests that military conditioning is kind of the same. You prepare people to go and fight, to go and kill, but their sensitivity is going to return by itself. And again, to me, that's wishful thinking. And we also have no empirical support for that. So if that's far-fetched, then we've got to think, well, what can we do both kind of post facto after somebody has been morally injured to, unprogram them, or if we can't unprogram them to kind of restore their moral sensibilities, maybe we need to compensate them in some way. Maybe that's something for which compensation is owed. And the form that the compensation might take, I read a fascinating article recently, which was about there was a case in the US where a veteran goes on trial for murder. He receives a sentence, but then the court finds that his lawyer failed to mention that this person's a veteran. And they deemed that to be an example of insufficient support as counsel. It's basically saying, had we known this, that he was a veteran, we would have given him a lighter sentence. So the fact that you didn't mention it as his lawyer means you didn't do a good enough job. So retrial. Right? Wow. So what does that suggest, right? It's basically saying, well, this article argues that that might seem bizarre. Like, why should it matter? You committed a murder. Why should it matter if you're a military veteran? But this person, the author's name I forget, argues that essentially if the state is responsible for the fact that you are now the sort of person that's more liable to commit murder because you've been morally injured in the course of your military conditioning, then the state should discount the penalties that it imposes on you afterwards. I'm not sure how convincing that is, but that might be another form of like compensation, right? So there's sort of like what can we do after the fact? But I'm more interested in what can we do before the fact, kind of prophylactic interventions which prevent the onset of moral injury in the first place. And there has been some discussion around certain kinds of bioscientific interventions, giving certain drugs like, Adderall and propranolol and so on. So those are the two things that we need to explore. What can we do in advance to try and achieve, have our cake and eat it too, if you like, try and ensure that our soldiers can do their job effectively without emotional disintegration, but at the same time without being kind of morally injured. So is there something we can do? There hasn't been any research. And I'm proposing to do that. That research. That's sort of that's where I'm going. That's the next. Well, the evolution, I guess, of this line of inquiry is very much trying to understand. I mean, it's there will be some hurdles, obviously. Not least because there is in some circles at least, people think that this whole idea of moral injury or PTSD of late, that it's slightly overblown and that it's potentially exploitation of trying to get something out of the in that compensation space from the government. Undoubtedly there's a percentage, like with everything, there's a percentage that will exploit the system. But I think it's, I don't know what your thoughts are, but I think for me, at least, the way I see it is it's probably because we're now talking about it and it's, a lot more encouraged to talk about. And we're learning things that we didn't know previously about this very point. That the process of inculcating, military values, norms, behaviors itself has an impact. It leaves a residue on your character, on your person. I think it was with David Wedham. I think I spoke with, and we talked about in that instance it was about war crimes and in the impact of the environment on war crimes. And it's now becoming, at least it was in the UK for a couple of cases, recognised that the environment and what
what mental state a soldier was in. If not, it can serve, if not as defense, but certainly as mitigating circumstances to any of the behaviors that a soldier has carried out. Which again is a recognition that the military setting, the context, has an impact of who we are. It changes behavior. Obviously, Kurt Lewin's famous formula, that behavior is a function of the personality and the environment. We can't deny that. And if we're trying to, if we're now tinkering with the personality or character, then all you need is the environment, and you're going to have, you can almost predict the types of behaviors you're going to get. Which, again, the point, and I completely echo what you're saying. This is not to say that it's wrong, which is what's going to be. I can suspect the response from many of my listeners is, "Hey, that's wishful thinking." Well, no, that's not what you're saying here. What we're saying is that, hey, we need to account for this. We need to be aware of it. We need to acknowledge it. Let's not push this to the extreme. It's the kind of left and right argument.
Exactly.
God forbid you say that Trump had some good ideas straight away. You're part of the the Hitler Youth, right? Not that I would say that, but that's the kind of general narratives. Or if you talk against Trump, straight away you're the kind of your Antifa, and that's generally how it's a separate problem. But I think the battle you're fighting is likely to face the same challenges that people will throw you straight into the extreme of a position, as opposed to actually listening to what the position proposes. There was another interesting point, and I think is related to our previous discussion, and you talk about the civil military gap, especially related to the culture of a military versus a culture of a society. And you quote Huntington, who previously said that the military needs to be culturally different from a liberal society. Can you explore that? Because I think that really speaks to our previous discussion as well.
Yeah. So the thought is, and this is something we have evidence for as well, quite a lot from quite a few different countries. Wherever you've got a professional standing army, where a subsection of society makes soldiering their livelihood. So the kind of arrangement that most liberal democratic countries have now, the military and civilian worlds will tend to kind of drift apart and develop different and sometimes conflicting sets of values, ideologies, attitudes. And that's especially, it's not just in liberal democratic countries, but it tends to be most pronounced in liberal democratic countries because, like you say, in these countries, what the civilian population values most in your average liberal democratic country is what they've been conditioned to value most: individual freedom,
themselves,
personal fulfillment, self-realization, ambition. But if that's the sort of thing that soldiers valued, armed forces wouldn't be able to function very effectively if they had this kind of me mentality. So in the military, different values prevail and have to prevail, arguably. Obedience to authority, which is the opposite of individual autonomy. Service before self, which is the opposite of self-realization.
Yeah.
Okay. So the idea is a society that's organized around military values and principles. Well, that wouldn't be a liberal democratic society. While a military organized around liberal democratic values, well, that wouldn't be an effective military. So that's why this gap emerges. That's why it's plausible to say, you have to have this gap. Yeah. And we've got, like I say, we've got evidence of it. Lots of different countries. I think the most recent that I came across was in France, where they kind of surveyed people in the military and surveyed civilians to see how they ranked the importance of certain things. So, on the list, you had things like patriotism and civic duty and discipline. And, the military people put those values first. Civilians put those values last, right? What they put first was human rights, individual freedom, right? So that's the civil military gap.
And it's a really, I recognize it. I hear it. I know it. It absolutely strikes me, even though I'm, a sample of one. It really speaks to me because that's absolutely what the military is about. It's about, giving your life for your social group, whatever that social group might be, or for your mate. and I think there's also research of what soldiers fear the most is letting down their mate. It's not saving the world, or not killing the big bad enemy, or being killed even, which is almost striking, given that that's kind of the ultimate price to pay, but that's not what soldiers fear the most, which again speaks to this very point. Which it's a really and I think there was another interesting thing you talked about in the book, is that's the kind of the warrior class sense of superiority, or the veteran superiority complex. Again, I'm a veteran, I'm a current serving member. The amount of times I've said bloody civilians, because they just won't get things done, or it just things aren't efficient. I'm always waiting, etc., etc. But again, that's I've also been outside for enough years to realize that to have seen the other side as well, and to also see the many downsides that they come with the military inculcated mind. And I think that's maybe you want to add something. What is the veteran superiority complex that you talk about in the book? And I'm also conscious that a lot of my audience are veterans, so this is not about in any way, and I'll let you explain it, but it's certainly not in any way to shame or denigrate veterans. I'll let you explain it.
Look, it's not a term that I coined. It's a term. It's a term coined by a veteran.
Yes. Yeah.
Right, Carl Forsling. So, I mean, essentially, what happens sometimes when you get this civil-military gap that we just described, military personnel will not only see themselves as different from civilians, but better than civilians. They
don't get it. The civilians don't get it.
Yeah. Or they're just, in some respect, they're deficient compared to military people. They're less fit, they're less disciplined. Whatever the case, they're less efficient. Fill in the blanks.
Prove me wrong.
Look, maybe it's whether it's justified or not. Where does this? I think it's an interesting question to think about where this veteran superiority complex comes from. Like, what are the roots of it?
Yeah,
that hasn't been studied enough. There are probably a few things that contribute. To some extent, I think it's just a natural byproduct of the civil-military gap, right? If I've been conditioned to value, say, service before self, but these civilians are out there living these completely self-absorbed materialistic lives, which are the contradiction of my values, of course I'm going to think less of them. They're living by values which, according to my values, are pathetic and despicable. Yeah. Right? But there's probably more to the story, and it hasn't really been fleshed out. A recent issue of Journal of Military Ethics, Larry Lengbeyer speculates that things like war commemoration and thank you for your service, these practices, he thinks, they feed into veteran superiority complex.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I just can't see how that wouldn't be true. I know what it's like on Anzac Day when you're walking around with, with some medals and, this is your day. The sense of overwhelming pride and joy that most veterans feel, and also the community feels the need to acknowledge, and like you said, the thank you for your service. And of course, when you're being praised time and time again, that of course has an impact on one's feeling of self.
So I think we kind of need to talk about, though, there's sort of the positive aspects of this, but then there are the dangers associated with it as well. Because, your listeners might be thinking, okay, so there are these practices that make veterans feel kind of superior and good about themselves. So what? Like, what's the big deal? The risk is, and this kind of comes to one of the other risks or costs of military establishments. One of the risks is, with this veteran superiority complex comes a lesser concern for the civilians that are in the theater, right? So I'm going to show less regard to them because they're just civilians. They're like the civilians back home, lazy, fat, whatever. But it also feeds into the risk of military coup. It's basically, circumstances under which the people in the military become resentful of the fact that they are subordinate to the civilian world. So it's sort of a practical extension of the veteran superiority complex. So
that's an interesting one. Yeah, that's an interesting one because you dedicate an entire chapter to this. And again, for us in democratic societies, they might strike people as a surprise. People will go as if Australia is at risk of a coup. Why is that a cost that we need to account for? But there is some surprises to that, isn't there?
Yeah, like it's since the invasion of Ukraine, something struck me. Everyone's response to that has been, you see, this is why we need a powerful military. But then over the last 2 years, several states have been conquered by their own military. Myanmar, Sudan, Burkina Faso. And we don't look at these cases and say, you see, that's why we shouldn't have a military. And that's curious. The fact that our military can defend us against external threats is seen as a compelling reason to have a military. But the fact that the military itself poses a threat to its parent society, that's not seen as a reason at all against having a military. And there's something weird going on there, particularly because considering that statistically, militaries are much more likely to attack their own country than they are to attack a foreign country, right? So how many interstate wars have there been since, say, 1950, where one military is used to defend itself against an invading military? There have been a few cases, a few times that's happened. How many militaries have attacked their own country, though, over that same period of time? It's about 470.
Yeah,
right?
wow, okay.
So it's an average of 9 coups every year for 50 years.
Wow.
Right.
Yeah.
So states create these militaries to defend them against external attack, but then that institution becomes a threat to that state. And sometimes it really looks like an irrational trade-off. I was reading about Bolivia recently. Hasn't been invaded, has no enemies to speak of in this day and age, at least. But since 1950, the Bolivian military has attempted 23 coups.
Yeah, wow.
Right.
Okay.
So over that time. So, like going back to the domestic analogy, imagine you hired a private security guard to defend you. Yeah. When you're walking around in Bankstown, to protect you.
You'd need one.
To protect you from violent hooligans, right? But then he starts getting drunk and beating you up every other day.
Yeah.
Maybe you'd just be better off without a security guard, huh? And I think we can extrapolate to some states. Some of them I look at and I think, you'd probably be better off without a military, all things considered. Sure, if you get rid of it, you're going to be vulnerable in some ways, but there's always trade-offs. There's trade-offs with everything.
Yeah, exactly right. But I mean, the response would be that, we're in a democracy and, our rulers or our government dictates how we're going to use the military.
Yeah. So this is a kind of a really important addition. There's one question we need to ask is about relative likelihoods. Okay. You might say, coups happen, hundreds of them. But you might think, coups are something that happen over there. Coups are something that happen to other countries, in Africa and South America. They don't happen in mature democracies, for example. Thing is, it's just not true. So the single greatest threat to democratic governments is still the military coup. So most democratic governments that have fallen over in the last 50 years have fallen over because of military coups. So it turns out the fact that a state is a democracy doesn't really insulate it very much from a coup. And there's been some very interesting research around this. For example, some of the research shows that, in some ways, democracy helps to forestall a coup because, democratic governments in some of these developing countries, you've got this local dictator and he's very paranoid. So he starts to purge the military because he's worried about them. So they look at him and they're fearful of him. So they might attack him in kind of fear-induced aggression, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in democracies, that doesn't really happen. The military doesn't have so much to fear because democratic governments don't behave this way with these preemptive purges and so on. So that makes a coup less likely. But then on the other hand, some of this research suggests precisely because democratic governments are less likely to really seriously fight back in the event of a coup, that makes a coup more attractive. So basically, democracy has contradictory effects on the likelihood of coup. And it turns out they just kind of cancel each other out. So democratic institutions by themselves, don't really have any much bearing on the likelihood of a coup. Other things do, though. For example, it's not so much democracy, it's more kind of affluent capitalism, right? Rich countries are much less likely to. The argument, we're a democracy, so it won't happen here, that's much less plausible than the argument, we're rich, so it won't happen here. And that's true, right? So the coup proneness of different countries varies radically, but so does the likelihood of being invaded by a foreign country. That also varies very radically. So we've just got to, it just goes into the calculus, right? We've got to think, okay, if we have a military, there's a risk of coup, but what's the likelihood of that happening? What's the likelihood of us withstanding it? If we don't withstand it, what will its consequences actually be? What will it look like day to day? We've got to compare that against, even if the possibility is very low. But what if your possibility of being attacked by a foreign country is even lower?
Are you accounting for that?
It's still arguably an irrational risk. Your security is still arguably going down.
So what does it look like in your mind for Australia? I mean, what is the calculus for Australia?
I've gotten this question before, and I'm nervous about answering it just because I'm ignorant of so much historical and of so much history and political science. But the kind of commentaries that I look at very widely. So let's go back. The prospect of China invading Australia. I was reading something on the Australia Institute's website just a couple of days ago, and this was back 2018. Things may have changed, although I doubt it. But they did a survey, and 42% of Australians thought that there was a significant likelihood of China attacking Taiwan. Sorry, 49%. 49% of Australians think there's a significant likelihood of China attacking Taiwan. 42% of Australians think that there's a significant likelihood of China invading Australia.
Oh, wow.
And that strikes, like, if that's true, let's just go with it. Let's say that that's true, that China is itching to get its hands on our land and resources, and to them, they're not worried about putting out bushfires. So let's just say that there's a significant likelihood, and if we don't have these deterrent capabilities, then it's highly likely that we're going to be conquered and subdued by China. Well, if that's true, then the cost that we should be willing to bear for the sake of having the deterrent is quite high, of course. But if, on the other hand, other voices just say, I might think of it this way. How many invasions has China participated in the last 50 years versus how many invasions has Australia participated in? So this is just a way of saying we're not going to get invaded by China. They have no interest in that. If we get attacked by them, it's more likely to be one of these cases of fear-induced defensive aggression. They're more worried about us meddling in their affairs. So if the chances of this sort of thing are very low, then the cost we should be willing to bear is accordingly lower. Like, I'm reluctant to give you an unequivocal answer to
of course.
the question, because
you can't. I mean, there are so many variables.
I don't know what the likelihood. Maybe I'm just irrationally optimistic and naive, and I just don't think that there's a significant likelihood of China invading Australia. So in that case, I'm inclined to say, insofar as the circumstances under which we're likely to need a military are less likely to arise. Naturally, I'm going to say the cost we should be prepared to sustain for the sake of the institution is less. But whether we're at that threshold, whether the Australian military is too costly, all things considered, I don't know. I'm just trying to get.
No,
I'm trying to tell people these are the things that you need to think about. You got to plug in your own values, though. I can't give you the values. So,
Ned, that all makes perfect sense, and interestingly, I think it also pivots to the next thing I want to talk about, and that's the cognitive biases you talk about, because everything we've just touched on, about our perceptions of the threat, as well as how that perception is even installed or programmed into our mind, has a lot to do with how we think. And of course, our biases, our heuristics, what we've seen before, etc., play a big part. And there's a really interesting chapter, probably my favorite chapter of the book, is the cognitive biases that may lead us to the misuse of the military. There's the first part is the overconfidence on the prospect of success by political leaders when considering war. What is the issue here? What is this overconfidence calculus that ends up playing out as we contemplate war?
So, according to the just war tradition, it's morally permissible for states to use force under certain circumstances when certain conditions are met. Needs to be a just cause, needs to be proportional, needs to be a last resort to have a reasonable prospect of success. So when I say misuse of military force, I basically mean any use of military force in excess of what is prescribed by those conditions. Okay, so I agree with that. All of those conditions need to be met. The problem that I think just war theorists haven't taken seriously enough is that our minds are full of unconscious biases that are prone to distort our assessment of these various conditions. They act as though the mind is like a truth detection machine, and we can just see clearly when it's proportional, when it's a last, and it's just not the case. There are these gremlins in our heads that steer us towards false positives. So take reasonable prospect of success. Just says it's wrong to wage war where it's predictably futile. If you've got no realistic chance of winning, you shouldn't
unjust.
Go to war. Yeah. But problem is, states and their military generals always think they have a reasonable chance of winning, even if they don't. And that's because there's an unconscious bias towards overconfidence. We're all guilty of it. Everyone thinks that they're better than they are. And there's sort of an evolutionary explanation for that.
What is it? What's the explanation?
So the explanation is, I might butcher it here, but it's something like, in our evolutionary history, there were people that were overconfident and people that were kind of appropriately confident and people that were underconfident. If you were one of the overconfident types, and again, this is way back in our evolutionary history, you were more likely to seize different opportunities. Sometimes they would backfire because you're overconfident and you've overestimated your own capabilities.
And you died,
And you died. But in the scheme of things, basically, these people out-survived the others. They reproduced more than the others. So that's why that's kind of an evolutionary hangover. Even though it might not serve the inhabitants of today's world in the way that it did our ancestors, but it's still there. Right. So it's just, this is not anything specifically about military people.
No, absolutely. It's part of our human evolutionary. And again, it resonates. I mean, we're always told, be confident, demand what you want. This is, if you don't stand up for yourself, no one else will, et cetera, et cetera. This is part of the almost folklore that comes with, success and achievement, et cetera. So it totally makes sense. Yeah.
So there's probably, something deep seated in that. But then I think what you're alluding to as well is that it's also kind of culturally reinforced. And maybe that's where the military environment's particularly important, because I get a sense that confidence is especially prized in the military.
Absolutely.
Back yourself. Don't hesitate. So kind of that, it's not to say that military conditioning is the cause of overconfidence. It's just to say that it exacerbates it. Right. it reinforces. So this is why, I mean, there's a great book called Overconfidence of War, and it just shows that the wars from the century 1815 to 1915, they were all undertaken with every side firmly believing that it will win. So and fast forward, the Americans thought that Iraq would be a cakewalk. Putin thought that Ukraine would be over by now. So, just war theory demands a reasonable prospect of success, but then you've got this cognitive bias which impairs people's ability to make a sound, impartial assessment of their actual likelihood of success. So it's basically, the problem is you've got this theory, but everyone always thinks that they satisfy the theory. So what good is the theory?
That was going to be my question. It begs the obvious question. I mean, just war tradition, is it an illusion that is justified subjectively by those embracing it? There's sufficient scope for discussion, at least, on it. This is not to say that, again, it's the best we've got, and I completely support the thinking behind it. It is the best we've got, but it's certainly not foolproof. And what is the Einstein Effect, which again is it's so relevant? I mean, I'll let you explain it, but I mean, we see it this time and time again. So what is the Einstein Effect?
The Einstein Effect? It's associated with what's sometimes called, the law of the hammer or the law of the instrument. Give a small boy a hammer, and he'll find that everything he encounters needs pounding. So it's just kind of the tendency. You've got this tool, and it's the tendency to develop a kind of tunnel vision where that's the only tool you can see now, and you think every problem, this is the solution. So Einstein Effect, more specifically though, is if you've encountered a certain problem a number of times, and each time you've solved that problem with this same method, what tends to happen is you get this tunnel vision where that method is now the only one that you can see, and alternatives become essentially invisible to you. That's the Einstein Effect. So it's another cognitive bias that leads to the overuse of military force, because just war theory again tells us we shouldn't use military force unless it's a last resort. This is necessary. Unless there are no peaceful alternatives. But if we're in the grip of the Einstein Effect, we might fail to see these peaceful alternatives, even if they're there, right? I think that this probably goes some way towards explaining why it is that some countries, like the US, for example, are the ones that are always going to war. It becomes a fixated mindset. If that's the way you've solved problems in the past, that solution is the one that's up in lights in your mind. It's more salient. So it's the one, and thereby kind of occludes your view of all of the other options. So, there are all of these cultural explanations about why certain countries are more war prone than others. But maybe this is sort of a deeper, just a psychological explanation. We've used this method before, the method's worked, and now that's just most prominent in our thinking.
You see this as well. I mean, in particularly with the US with the gun violence and gun ownership. I mean, it's the same thing. It's the Einstein Effect having, the only thing that's going to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. And we might have a few examples of that. And that's the, and I mean, I was just recently listening to somebody who I greatly admire, Sam Harris. But he's also a gun owner, and he's broadly speaking in support of having a gun at home to respond to the inevitable invader that's going to come and steal your stuff. Firstly, the preemptive strike game comes to mind straight away. That if both of us have guns, and both of us know that we have guns, chances are one of us is going to pull the trigger, or the chances are much greater. But also, if this is the kind of the culturally enforced norm that, if I have a gun, I use it to self-defense, then chances are I'm going to use it.
Yeah. And also, I mean,
you can't see the solution.
Yeah. And the coup analogy is very apt there as well. So, you have a gun in the home to protect you from outsiders, but now you need protection from insiders, including like your children, what do they call child access shootings? They're so often where a child gets a hold of a gun and shoots a member of the household. And so many people just, another point of comparison, gun owners just overestimate their ability to prevent that sort of thing from happening. So I read a study where they did interviews with parents and with children, and a huge proportion of parents could have sworn that their children had never handled the firearms when they had.
Yeah.
Right. So we overestimate our ability to control these things falling into the wrong hands and being misused. And I think the same goes for militaries. States exaggerate their ability to prevent a coup from happening and other kinds of meddling by the military and the military-industrial complex. So this is like another way that overconfidence feeds back into the discussion.
Absolutely.
You know, if we had more humility, I think if we had more humility and less confidence, I think we'd have far fewer of these kinds of problems.
Yeah.
But our minds aren't wired that way.
No, because we don't reflect enough. And again, because we are a programmable animal. And I think that's a difficult thing for us to acknowledge, that I'm not the master of my destiny, that external influences have an impact on my behavior, and that we are not as rational as we'd like to think, that we are not as autonomous as we'd like to believe. The moment you press that upon someone, that causes a resistance, because we identify with so much of it. I mean, gun violence. I mean, US or gun ownership in the US is infused with identity. You know, the Second Amendment. It is what it means to be, in many ways, American, which for us is unthinkable. I mean, we sit back here and I sit and listen to Sam Harris's argument and just think, hold on a minute, I don't have a gun in my house. If somebody tries to break in and take something, chances are they're not either going to have a gun. Chances are I'm just going to go, mate, take whatever you want and get out of here, right? Because, hey, nothing is worth my death or the intruder's death. Nothing in my house that I own, nothing is worth, either of our deaths or our families. And I think that's part of the cultural programming as well. Maybe the last question, and I'm conscious of the time, and I know I've really stretched it here, but I just want to touch on the epilogue of the book, where you talk about Gene Sharp, who's of course the proponent for, non-military or non-violent ways to solving conflict. And I found it interesting that this is where you end your book, and I want to ask you why you end the book with that, and what is it that Gene Sharp or that line of thinking offers us in this debate about what is the military for, and is it worth its costs?
Why I ended the book this way, partly because I wanted to end on a kind of a hopeful note. It's sort of a negative book in some ways. I'm taking something that exists and I'm playing defense, and I'm kind of saying, well, we need to think a bit more carefully about whether
it's an introspective book. I think
we should have that.
Yeah.
But the epilogue is meant to say, but maybe we can have all of the things that this institution provides us, which we don't want to let go of, without the costs. Like, just have an alternative way of doing it. So Gene Sharp was the guy who said, there's this particular problem that we are faced with, the problem of international aggression, international terrorism. Maybe there's solutions to that other than giving a whole bunch of teenage boys high-powered weapons. Maybe we've advanced enough to think of other ways of doing that. So he proposed this what he called a post-military defense system, and it's really just the one in which the civilian population of a country engages in mass coordinated subversion and sabotage to drive out a foreign aggressor, as opposed to a military defense system where soldiers with guns do that. So, the logic behind it is simply, foreign aggressors have goals. They don't normally attack just for the sake of it. They're trying to achieve something. If they come, if we do get invaded by China, it's not just for entertainment's sake. It's to conquer and rule, to extract resources, to gain control over the native people and profit off our labor and so on. Okay, so aggressors have goals. In order for the aggressor to achieve these objectives at an acceptable cost, he needs the native population to behave in certain ways, right? So if you want to profit off our labor, well, we need to labor, right? If you want to extract resources from our land, well, you'll need participation of farmers and technicians and miners and transport workers and so on. So the aggressor can't typically get these things that he came for without some measure of cooperation from the target population, right? So a post-military defense system kind of looks like this, and I'm really simplifying. You get invaded. In response, the people just withdraw from the economic, political, social life of the state. We don't work, we don't pay taxes, we don't obey regulations, and we also engage in subversion and sabotage. We do blockades and sit-ins, and we dismantled infrastructure and machinery and so on. And now, sure, like you might be thinking, oh yeah, but isn't he going to use violence to force us to do that stuff? Yeah, the aggressor might respond with violence, but he's going to use violence anyway. Whether we are using violence or non-violence, the aggressor is prepared to use violence. So that goes without saying. That's a constant. So basically, the post-military defense arrangement is about mass non-cooperation and obstruction to the point that the aggressor has to put more into the occupation than he gets out of it. So it's winning not by force, but by kind of political economics. Right? The people stubbornly refuse to play along. The aggressor needs to spend all of these extra resources enforcing compliance, bringing in his own manpower to do the jobs that our farmers won't. After a while, the fruits of the conquest just get whittled down, and it's no longer a winning proposition, and they bugger off. And read Sharp's work. There's been so many cases of this sort of thing in history. It doesn't.
And I think it stands up. It statistically stands up as the more effective way to defend, right?
Your listeners might be thinking, okay, that might work sometimes, but it's not going to work all the time. Yeah, but violence is not going to work all the time either. The biggest military in the world spent 20 years and how many trillions of dollars replacing the Taliban with the Taliban. How'd violence work out in this? So
exactly.
There's always, nothing's guaranteed to succeed. And furthermore, we have no real reason to believe that violence is more likely to succeed. So why do we stick with it despite the costs? The costs,
and I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, we evolved enough now to start seeing beyond it and to acknowledge that just the physiology of young men and guns. The testosterone pumping through, the sense of the need to belong, the need for status. All of these things contribute to violence, and we see this time and time again. I mean, Dr. Mike Martin talks about this quite a lot, and I've interviewed on the pod about it. But Ned, I know that we've really kind of hit the hard right of our timing, so I just want to say thank you so much. I've thoroughly enjoyed the book. I think you can judge by the amount of post-it notes I've got and questions and etc. So there's plenty more that we could have talked about. And in saying that, I hope that I can speak with you again at some point in the near future, because I really like the way you're capturing a very, very important topic, one that's not discussed. And especially as somebody who is ultimately on the inside teaching at the Australian Defence Force Academy, which is why I said at the start that this is a very brave book, because I'm sure there were many people in your classrooms and around you who will kind of shake their head and go, Ned, what? How is this? So thank you very much for writing it. I think it's a very, 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 very interesting read, and I'll certainly put a link to it on the show notes.
Thanks very much, Maz. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you for listening to another episode of The Voices of War. And since you got this far, please consider showing your support by liking and reviewing the show wherever you catch your pods. Also, if you're able, please consider showing your support through our Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee page. Links to both are in the show notes. Thank you, and until next time.